Chapter 26, Section 3, World War II, the European Theater. We're in your United States history book. We've been talking about World War II, and now we're going to be getting into it as America has now entered the war. The European theater will cover not only Europe, but also North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, and on to the Soviet advance, the invasion of Europe, the Battle of the Bulge, and on to a little special excerpt on the Tuskegee Airmen. This is all in your book. So as you can see here, the war now was being fought in the air with the Air Force, onto the sea with our Navy, and onto land with our Army in Europe. So let's begin. Going to Europe, General Eisenhower. Well, President Roosevelt made war in Europe a first priority in responding to Winston Churchill's plea for help. Winston Churchill now was Prime Minister of England, and it was getting very bleak as London was being bombed in the Battle of Britain and all this going on, and England was the last resort. Germany had already overtaken most of the countries in Europe, including France. And so we have basically, the president wanting to make sure that England was still in the battle and they didn't lose the European theater to Germany. So he appointed General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who lived 1890 to 1969, to be the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Here's a picture of him right here. The Allies' headquarters were going to be in London, and began to be planned the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe from London. More than 15 million men and women joined the United States Armed Service at this time. Army service soldier would be called a GI. I just remember, when I was young, having GI Joes, little soldiers, and we called them GI Joes. We didn't really know what GI meant, but really GI meant government issue. And it became the nickname for the average American soldiers. So when he was over in Europe, they called him a GI from America. So GI Joe or GI whatever, So, but anyway, in 1942, it was very bleak for the Allies, as I said before. The German U-boats had invested the whole Atlantic Ocean, and they sank more than 6.2 million tons of vital war materials that were sent to Europe. So as we were sending more materials over to Europe and sending supplies, the Germans were sinking our boats going over there very quickly. So we knew that we had to make this point a priority, at least the president knew, is to, in the seas, and to deal with these German U-boats. Here's a picture of a GI, government issued American soldier there. So a conflict also was going on in North Africa. As Roosevelt and Churchill, the Prime Minister of England, got together, they called this new operation Operation Torch, and it was going to be focused on Africa. In 1942, the Germans had threatened the Suez Canal, and this was Britain's link to all the oil reserves in the Middle East. It also was a major route of travel of all merchants and stuff to go through the canal, where they're going all the way around the whole continent of Africa. So Operation Torch began on November 8th, 1942, and this was called the invasion of North Africa. It began in Casablanca, went on to Oran and Algiers, as you can see in this picture, and focused on these spots. So the Axis dominated forces, all of the Axis dominated forces with Germany and Mussolini. They surrendered within only 1 week. You can see here as the Patton comes in here, and we see over here General Fredendall of the United Kingdom, and General Ryder of the United Kingdom, each putting forth attack on the Africa area. And so Germany surrendered. So General Eisenhower led the Allied forces eastward towards Tunisia. So, and then General Bernard Law Montgomery, who lived 1887 to 1976, and he was with the British 8th Army. He marched westward from Egypt to meet Eisenhower. So from westward from Egypt comes the English commander, and then Eisenhower's coming from the other direction, and they met in the middle. They had basically with Germany had a general that was called the Desert Fox, and he was a very good general. In fact, they all looked up to him, and even knowing that not what he was going to do next. But later on, when I look at his picture, I put his picture here, Erwin Rommel, because later on, he was well known by his men and his soldiers as an honest man, and he took care of his soldiers. That was kind of not always the case with the German generals, but later on he was actually implicated in an attempt to assassinate Hitler. So he ended up not agreeing with Hitler in his monstrosities, and Hitler had him commit suicide, or made him commit suicide in the midst. So at the end, towards the end of his life, he did not agree with what Hitler was doing when he found out. So we know some good things about Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox of the African Corps of Germany. It's kind of sad, that this went on. But we see that not all of the generals were behind everything that Adolf Hitler did in his monstrosity of the SS. But anyway, so the Nazis were then forced to surrender Tunisia on May 13th, 1943, and then Africa was totally secured by the Allies. So it was very quick in the midst, but it had been going on for quite a while prior to this time, before the United States came in. So in a way, the United States came and saved the day in Africa. The conquest of Sicily. So where's Sicily? It's an island right on the tip part of Italy in the Mediterranean Sea. And so it's very important because remember, Italy was one of the Axis powers under Mussolini. So the conquest of Sicily is very important. And so General George Patton, we're going to talk about General George Patton, was one of the American generals that we look back on as a great general and a hero. So the small German and Italian forces on Sicily were very unprepared, and quickly they were overwhelmed by the combined forces of General George Patton, 1885 to 1945, that's when he lived, and General Montgomery of the British Army. And so there were 100,000 Axis troops that had been evacuated to the Italian mainland. 100,000 of German troops had been evacuated, and they now were in Italy. And so the Italians started to really fear that war was going to be right in their homes, right on their homeland. So they, looking toward this and not really trusting Hitler and not really trusting Mussolini, the Italians, they weren't behind everything they were doing. On July 25th, they forced Mussolini and his government to resign. And Italy formally surrendered then to the Allies on September 8th and turned against the Axis powers. So Italy, basically an Axis power following Mussolini. They actually came and arrested Mussolini. If you go and follow up on what happened to Mussolini later on, they arrested him. They took him in, but then he left, and he left with his woman. Not his wife, but his sweetheart or whatever you call. But anyway, they left, and his famous car, his very expensive car, I don't know if it was a Lamborghini or what it was, and as they were driving, they drove someplace, they were apprehended again, and they were actually executed, at that time. So Mussolini was really executed by his own people, his Italian forces. It was kind of sad. And it's really sad that they took his body afterwards and they hung it up and people shot at it and everything else, and then they took his body and put it in a mausoleum, monks, where the monks stay, in a basically in a Catholic church, you know, for a while. It's just really strange, all this. But anyway, you can look it up and find out more about that. We know that the Italians weren't all behind Mussolini, the dictator. And Mussolini wanted to have a revived Roman Empire. He was looking to be this revived Antichrist figure. So, crazy. So, Italy formally surrendered to the Allies on September 8th and turned against the Axis powers. So, that's what we have. Italy now surrendering and turning against the powers and turning to, actually to America in the midst of, to the Allies. So the Italian campaign. So the Germans now in Italy, we have Italy here, is a pictured map of Italy. They refused to leave, and they actually turned Italy into a whole battleground, just what the Italians wanted not to happen. So they basically, Hitler coming in, finding out what happened to Mussolini. Here's a picture of Mussolini here before he was killed. So General Mark Clark's British Fifth Army encountered the German opposition and had to fight their way all the way to Rome. So you can see this as you see what trail they took, you know, what direction they took. They came from Sicily, the path through Italy, all the way up to this first Gustav line. All of this area was infiltrated with Germans at this time. So they had to break through this line. So there was a lot of fighting going on. The Germans fortified the Gustav line, right here, this line, as you see, north of Naples, and forced the Allies to fight for every inch of Italian soil. And some of the most bitter fightings of the war took place at Monte Cassino and Anzio in January of 1944. So a lot of fighting going on here in Italy. Germans really, you know, they wanted their Italy, they wanted their Rome. When I think of Hitler, he wanted the revived Roman Empire, and that was in Italy. So they were then reinforced by the British 8th Army. The American 5th Army also made a final attempt to crack the Gustav line and capture Rome in May of 1944. So in May of 1944, Rome then was captured. Here's Rome, picture right here. So to get through this line, to get to Rome, if you look, the major cities in Europe had been devastated. Paris was devastated, you know, and Berlin was devastated. I mean, we find out most of the cities, including Rome, was totally devastated. Here's a picture here because of the fighting in World War II. Anzio defenders broke out and joined the other Allied forces and pierced the German lines and entered Rome. And triumphantly, they won over Rome on June 4th. So basically coming in, Anzio, even some of the Italians there, as they had joined with the Allies force in Italy, as we said, and they were fighting. So they just, and the Germans, they had occupied it with 100,000 forces there, and it was very, very dramatic fighting. But the German forces held out until April 29, 1945. So even though Rome surrendered, still the German forces held out for quite a while there in Italy. But then the war in Italy was finally over. So the Italians experienced a lot of devastation from the war, as you can see. The Soviet advance. So now with Russia, while the British and Americans drove out the Axis from the Mediterranean, the Soviets, the Russians, were pressing towards Germany. So Hitler's 1942 offensive was crushed at Stalingrad on the Volga River, and the Soviets continued to drive the battered Nazis back through 1943 and 1944. In the last video, I explained how as Germany drew into Russia, Hitler thought it was going to be very easy conquering Russia, but they ran into what? The Russian winter. And so his Nazi army were not prepared for winter, and it was they didn't have, in fact, even the rains prior to winter, they got stuck in the mud and they got stuck in the snow. They didn't even have winter clothing. And so the Soviets now could drive them back and batter the Nazis back through 1943 and 1944. So you can see here, and then these are some of the devastation cities in like Moscow. And as you go through, I don't know, this is not Moscow, but there's pictures of Moscow too, of being totally devastated during this time, during World War II, the Russian soldiers here. The invasion of Europe, D-Day. So important that you remember that day, June 6th, because on June 6th, every year our military celebrates D-Day. So what is D-Day? Well, D-Day is where the greatest armada the world has ever seen was assembled in southern England along the English Channel in Normandy, France. D-Day is basically bringing all of our troops into Europe to fight for France, to fight for England, into the English Channel. So on June 6, 1945 would be the turning point of World War II in Europe, and it's called D-Day. Eisenhower's American, British, Canadian, and Free French soldiers landed in Normandy in France, northern France. And after securing the beachhead, the Allies broke through at St. Lo on July 19th. And then they raced across to France at Avranches under General Patton's Third Army. A second invasion then was launched on the French Riviera on August 15th. And the Free French forces then were finally liberated, and they liberated Paris on August 25th. So D-Day, important day, is when our troops landed on Normandy Beach, June 6th, 1944, a big turning point in the war for the Allies that was going on against Germany and the Axis powers. So just remember, what is D-Day? The other day, someone asked me, what is D-Day? Because it was June 6th just a few days ago. And I said, D-Day, Normandy, France had been conquered, and so France just totally like, here is America, they're coming here for us to help, D-Day, and the French were very excited that Paris was going to be liberated. It had been totally conquered by the Nazi forces. We saw the Nazi forces of Hitler even getting his picture taken under the Eiffel Tower, and Paris being devastated. So now we see America has come to take back France for the French. The Battle of the Bulge and the Screaming Eagles. So on December 1944, the Germans counterattacked in the Ardennes forest of Luxembourg and in Belgium, and they advanced across the Meuse River, hoping to recapture the busy port of Antwerp. So here we have, in the Ardennes forest, we have this fighting again. Remember, this was a place that was fought in World War I, in France. And so there were only 5 American divisions there, and they were recovering from heavy duty. But on the morning of December 16th, the German armies struck along the 85-mile front. And after the initial success, the Nazis were confined at Bastogne in Belgium by a heroic stand of American 101st Airborne Division, and this division was known as the Screaming Eagles. So this is another miracle. It's just so amazing. So here we have, in the midst, we're looking, there's only 5 American divisions recovering from duty in the forest there of Luxembourg and Belgium. And it's an area that, in the forest is there's a lot of fighting going. There's a lot of Germans in the midst, and they're counterattacking. And, the fighting is behind the bush, in the trenches type fighting in the midst. And then you would see the Battle of the Bulge actually coming, and you'll see it snowing here. I didn't realize that it had started snowing during this time, and they were actually caught there in the snow. But we see the Screaming Eagles. And the Screaming Eagles, the airborne division, came and saved the day. And the American 101st Airborne Division, known as the Screaming Eagles. And now we know we even have movies on the Screaming Eagles, that came to save the day for the American and Allied troops. The fall of the Third Reich. Oh my goodness. The fall of Hitler. The Third Reich is he called the Third Reich, the third, as he's taking in the third takeover, that he's going to take over the world, so on March 1945, the Soviets had invaded the East Germany. They were only 37 miles from Berlin on the east. And the Allied forces had forced the enemy to retreat behind the Rhine River. So that was Germany's last natural defense barrier. So here we had Germany, their defense was the Rhine River. They had overtaken the Rhine River. His forces there, his army, Hitler's army was there, and they were basically, fortifying so that there would be no cross of the Allied forces. And so Hitler did not believe they could cross that Rhine River, but an American patrol discovered a bridge across the Rhine River at Ramingen. And on March 7th, that the bridge was still intact. Here they are on the bridge, in fact. And they established this powerful bridgehead on the East Bank, bringing in the Allied forces to go across the Rhine River, which Hitler never expected. So the Germans were battered and caught by the massive bombing raids since 1943, and they were caught between the Russians on the east and the Americans on the west, and the French forces to the west too, all coming in. And the fall of the Third Reich would come. The fall of the Third Reich, the fall of Hitler. You see his forces here now. You see this battered plane, and you see coming over. Coming over the bridge here. That we were actually coming over the bridge of the Rhine River, coming in to the territory of the Third Reich of Germany. So now it would be Victory in Europe Day, called VE Day, May 8th, 1945. Now, it would not be. Japan was still fighting, remember. Well, not until like September did Japan surrender, and Japan would not have surrendered, unless the atomic bomb had not been dropped. But anyway, when we talk about May 8th, from May to September, Japan we'd still be in war with Japan. But on Victory in Europe Day would be very much a rejoicing for the Allied powers, because we know Germany now was quickly overrun on both sides. What did Hitler do? Adolf Hitler retreated to an underground bunker, and he committed suicide on April 30th, 1945, with his mistress. So he knew that was the end. He committed suicide. So now Berlin surrendered on May 2nd, and Berlin being the capital of Germany, and the Germans surrendered unconditionally on May 7th. So Berlin, the capital, they surrendered May 2nd. By May 7th, the whole German country had surrendered. And then on May 8th, 1945, now was declared Victory in Europe, called VE Day. So, as we see that fighting, the moment America entered into the European war, we see what happened, and it was a lot of victories, especially from the turning point of D-Day. From D-Day until the VE Day, America was on the offense, not on the end, and taking the defensive of that was before with Britain and France. Now they were on the offense with America, and the Allies won. What a great day of rejoicing, as you can see here. Victory in Europe Day. You see all of these cases of rejoicing. So this is Victory in Europe Day, but now we need to get into the other theater, which is Pacific theater in our fight with Japan. And we'll find probably a lot more casualties we had in fighting with Japan. So we will see. Throughout the war, there were 400,000 Americans that were killed during World War II, and most of them in the Pacific theater more than the European. But here we see Victory in Europe Day. This is just a little excerpt here about another combat group, and they were called the Tuskegee Airmen. In World War II, aerial combat was so important as a lot of the fighting occurred in the air. And there had never been any black pilots that had ever flown for the United States ever before. And so this was a door of opportunity that was opened for black pilots. On July 1941, 13 American cadets began training at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. And they were called the men of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, and they practiced together in makeshift structures and sleeping in tents. And then in 1942, the first lieutenant, George S. Roberts, from 1918 to 1984, became the squadron's first black American commander. So, and then in August of 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr., he lived 1912 to 2002, he assumed command of the 99th, and he was one of the most famous commanders of the American Air Force. So here we have a picture of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, and they were all black Americans. You never think about these things. Pretty amazing. The 99th was assigned to North Africa in April of 1943. In the fall, Colonel Davis then was transferred back to the United States because he came back to train new cadets. And so Roberts then led the 99th to many, many, many victories. So amazing. In 1944, the 99th became part of the 332nd fighter group under the leadership of Colonel Davis. And they called themselves the Fighting Red Tails. And they compiled an impressive war record, that is certain. They destroyed 261 enemy aircraft and damaged 148. The 332nd flew a total of 1,578 missions and over 15,553 sorts, which are short missions. They also escorted over 200 bombing missions. The Fighting Red Tails had opened a new door for opportunity for black Americans, that is certain. So here you have the 99th coming into the 332nd Fighter Group under Colonel Davis, and we have the Fighting Red Tails. So here's a picture of the Fighting Red Tails in the midst. And now with all those missions, come on, 1,578 missions and 15,540 short missions. Can you imagine that? And having over 200 bombing missions. So quite a record for the Fighting Red Tails and the first black Americans fighting in World War II. Amazing. So now we're going to go on in our next video. We're going to talk about the Pacific scene now, the Pacific theater and what was going on in our fight with Japan. So let's end our video there.